Good afternoon. I'm going to jump the timer a little bit because the clock on the wall says 2, so we'll go with that. Welcome to Southwest for our regular folks, and for those who are not from here, we're glad you're here today. And we'll be doing this grief seminar throughout the weekend. If you'd like to join us for services tomorrow, Jeff will also be teaching our morning Bible class and our worship service. We'll have a lunch and then an afternoon service that'll kind of wrap things all together. But we would love for you to be a part of all of those things this weekend. I was struck thinking about the timeliness of this. Jeff was very kind to reschedule from this morning to this afternoon because there was a funeral this morning that affected a lot of members here, and you just can't really escape grief. It is all around us. We've all experienced it at one time or another, maybe right now. We all have friends and loved ones who go through it too, and it's just kind of a natural thing in life. And I was also impressed thinking about Jeff, who's going to be speaking for us, that a couple of the largest ministry things he's done in life have come out of grief. These seminars, I think, were born at least in part out of the passing of his wife a few years ago from cancer. And the work he does with the Jenkins Institute, working with preachers and churches, is something that honors his father. And it's interesting that God can use something like that to affect so many lives. And so I know Jeff will walk us through a lot of things today. I won't take too much of his time, but just a couple things to mention to you. First of all, if you have any questions that either develop from the things you hear today or maybe questions you came in here with, if you want to write those down, there are visitor cards that we can use for that purpose on the back of the pews. You can just turn it over and it's blank. And you can write down a question, hand it to me or Jeff, and maybe there'll be some time before the next session to address some of that, or at the end of the next session, and he'd be happy to hit some of those things. Real quickly, Jeff has preached for a lot of years. I won't go through all the churches, but he's preached in Alabama, and I noticed on here at the University Church of Christ in Alabama, which it's a great church. North MacArthur, Oklahoma City, this one a little more familiar to us, and Louisville Church of Christ until 2021, when he started working full-time with the Jenkins Institute and the work that they do there. He's on the board at Freed-Hardman, a number of other boards. He told me not to read the whole thing, so I won't. But I know we will appreciate the things he has to share with us today. So before I turn it over to Jeff, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. God, we thank you for this afternoon. Thank you for a time that we can be together with people who are trying to follow you and people who want to learn more about how to navigate grief in their lives. Help us to be attentive, to be able to take from what Jeff has to say to us today, some nuggets that we can learn from, some things that will help us as we process things, and also some things that will help us as we encourage others. Thank you so much for the hope that we have in your Son, for the fact that we know that grief within our life is something that will end here in this life, and there will be hope that goes on with you forever, and help us always to live with that in our minds. Thank you so much for allowing us to love people at a level that we feel grief, and that we can have those depth of relationships that matter so much to us. Thank you for Jeff, for bringing him here safely, and for the things he'll share with us this weekend. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Well, thank you very much, Brian. It's a privilege to be here. I've been here before, and I've met some of you before, and I tried to meet most everyone before we got started. If I didn't meet you, I'm sorry. If I did, I'm sure I won't remember your name. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. We did 12 of these last year, and we'll do 13 this year. And there's some things I've learned that I want to share with you before we kind of get into the meat of what we want to talk about. I learn more than I teach when I'm at these seminars, because people talk to me about their story and about what they've been through, and that's meaningful if it's meaningful to you, it's meaningful to me. I had a mentor in Alabama who said everybody has a story, and probably every person in this room right now has a story about grief that you could share. And in some ways, I wish we had time just to let everybody stand up and share your story. But I hope that you'll do that. We'll have a break, and I hope if you haven't already done that with others who are here, I hope that you'll do that. I would be glad to hear. I would love to hear, as a matter of fact. And there are a couple of things I'm going to ask you to talk to me about. maybe to even email me later on, and we'll get to that as we go through our time together. We always seem like we always cry a little bit, and we always laugh a little bit, and I hope that if that's what we need to do, we'll do both of those. This is not a sermon. I'm a preacher by nature and by experience and by life, but this is not a sermon. This is about sharing with you what might be of some help. The other thing I want to say is, I'm probably not going to say something that is new to you, because if you've experienced grief, you will have experienced the things that we'll talk about. And it helps, though, sometimes to hear it from somebody else, and it helps to hear different perspectives, and so that's what we will try our best to do. And so and as Bruce mentioned, if you have questions, please write them down, hand them to him or me, and we'll do that at the end of the second session this afternoon. The first two sessions, part 1 and part 2, are some things I wish everybody knew about grief. And again, most of these things you'll probably already know, but I want to share them with you and hope that they'll be helpful to you in some way. And if you would like to write them down, I hope you'll do that. I think there's 10 of them. We'll see how far we get in the two sessions. If we don't get to all of them, I'll mention briefly the others. Number 1, this is crucially important. Grief is not a sin. It is not a sin. I know people who act like that if you grieve, then you must not have very much faith. If you grieve, you must be a sinner, because if you were really a strong Christian, you wouldn't grieve. Well, that's not only ridiculous, it's unbiblical. You know what the shortest verse in the Bible is? Of course you do. John 11, verse 35. Jesus wept. So if grief is wrong, then Jesus sinned, and we know that he did not sin. Do you know what verse 36 says? When the Jews saw that he was weeping, they said, "Look how much he loved him." One translation says, "Look how much he adored him." And what that means is that we will grieve when we lose people that we love. On this occasion, as you know, Jesus had lost his friend Lazarus. Lazarus was the brother of Mary and Martha, who were close friends of Jesus. He probably spent a lot of time in their home. Lazarus was probably very close to Jesus, and when word came to him that he was dying, Jesus made his way there. And of course, he didn't get there until after Lazarus had died. And Jesus loved him so much that when he got there, everything that had happened compressed itself into that moment in John 11, verse 35, that says Jesus wept. There's something interesting about that verse. The word wept there, the Greek word, dekryo, did you know that it's the only time that word is used in the Bible? It's not used anywhere else. And one of the things that tells me is that there's something unique about this situation. That Jesus, when he learned about his friend Lazarus, and he arrived and he was in the presence of Mary and Martha and other people who loved Lazarus, that Jesus wept. So grief is not sinful. The second thing I want to mention, again, there are three primary passages. Just John 11 is one. The second one is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And you've probably read this. You've probably heard this read at a funeral before, but let me read it to you again. Verse 13, Paul is writing to the church at Thessalonica. I lead tours over to Greece. We're going next year in October, and we go to Thessalonica, and our tour guide always reminds us that you don't call it Thessalonica. It's called Thessaloniki. But I've learned that they've mispronounced a lot of Greek words over there. That the way I learned them at Fried Hardeman in first year Greek. That's a joke. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren. Apparently, these people had some questions about grief. And one of the questions had to be about, is it okay to mourn? Is it okay to grieve? Because he said, I don't want you to be uninformed about those who are asleep, so that, listen to this, so that you will not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. Now notice, he didn't put a period after he said that you will not grieve. There's no period after that. Paul knew, and the Holy Spirit knew, that there will be experience in our life that will bring grief to our heart. And he said, I don't want you to grieve like people who don't have hope. If you're a Christian, your grief is not lost on the fact that you have hope as a child of God. And then he goes into detail to explain why we don't have to grieve like others. And the answer is because Jesus has been raised from the dead, and someday he will raise us from the dead as well. The last passage I want to mention is 2 Corinthians chapter 1. I want you to hear Paul's words beginning in verse 3. And these words, over the past 4.5 years, have become more meaningful to me, perhaps than any other verses in the Bible. And if you haven't read them, you don't read them, I hope you'll read them. And I hope you'll write these verses down. And I hope you'll read this often. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort. Paul is writing this in verse 3. He says that God is the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort. And then look at verse 4. Who comforts us in all of our afflictions, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we have been comforted by God. For just as the sufferings of Christ are ours in abundance, so also is our comfort is in abundance through Christ. So, a couple of things. Number one, God is the God of all comfort. Secondly, he comforts us in all of our afflictions. The word all there, the Greek word, the word is pas, and it means, you know what it means? It means all. It means that God comforts us in all of our afflictions. Now, there are many kinds of afflictions in life. Not all afflictions have to do with death, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But whatever affliction somebody faces, the very best way to receive comfort is to receive comfort from God, because he is the God of all comfort, and then he comforts us, those of us who are children of God. He comforts us in all of our afflictions. Whatever affliction you deal with in life. Listen, if there is any comfort in your life, if there's any comfort in my life, it is because God. Now, God uses his people, and that's what he says in the last part of this. He comforts us in all of our afflictions so that we can bring comfort to others with the same comfort with which we ourselves have been comforted. So, my good friend Dean Miller says, don't waste your pain. Don't waste your pain. What that means is when you've suffered pain and grief, be willing, if you can and when you can, to share that with other people who can be comforted in the same way that you've received comfort. Don't waste your pain. And so that's why we do these seminars. I went to the cemetery yesterday, the Old Hall Cemetery in Louisville, Texas. 56 months ago, on the 22nd of June, we laid my wife's body in the ground. She had suffered with cancer for 27 years, on and off. A lot of those years were good years. The first time she was 32 years of age, and she got breast cancer, and they did chemotherapy and radiation, and they said we were 99.9% sure we got it all. They kept her on chemo for pill for many years, and we moved to Dallas, Texas, to Louisville, Flower Mound, and when we moved to Texas, she felt some pain in her back. She thought she had lifted some boxes and hurt herself, so she went to the doctor, and the doctor said the cancer has returned, and it's all in your bones in your back. Well, they did more radiation, and the doctor said, we think we got it. And then 12 years later, it came back. And this time, the doctor said, it's taking over your body. We think you have about 2 years left to live. She lived about 16 months. And then she passed away, and we buried her on June the 22nd, 2019. The hardest days of my life. I'd lost a good friend in high school. I'd lost my mother, and then my father, and my wife and I had lost a little baby boy. I've preached many, many funerals, hundreds through the years, but nothing had prepared me for that experience that I was going to go through. And I'm sure that you could tell us your story. And I'm sure that you would say that there's nothing that you've had to go through that is quite like that in your life. But what I know is that God has comforted me. He's comforted me through his word. He's comforted me through his people. He's comforted me through his spirit. He's comforted me through my children and my grandchildren. God is the God of all comfort. And I don't want to waste my pain. That's why we do these seminars. Number one, grief is not sinful. Number two, no grief is the same. No grief is the same. Now, by that, I mean that no two types of grief are the same, first of all, and no two people are going to grieve the same way. This is crucially important that we understand this. If we are going to be able to navigate our way through grief and the pain that we endure, we must know that no two people grieve the same way. Unfortunately, there's not a book that says, here's 10 easy steps to get you through grief. There's no such book. And the reason is because no two people grieve the same way. And sometimes people will say to you, let me tell you what you need to do now. And I've heard people say all kinds of things. People used to say to me after Laura passed away, they would say, now, Jeff, you've got to learn to take one day at a time. And I'd hear that and I'd think, one day at a time? What are you talking about? How about one step at a time? How about 1 second at a time? So nobody can tell you how to grieve. What that means is that however you are grieving, if you trust God, however you are grieving, it is not wrong. It's right. Let me illustrate it. My mother died in 2005. We buried her on Christmas Eve in 2005. A good friend of mine who is a deacon at the Louisville church, his mother died the same day, and they buried her on Christmas Eve in 2005. After my mother died, my father was a preacher, and they had a funeral at the church building, and everybody left the church building, and it was late at night after we'd gone out to the cemetery and come back to the church building, and my dad said, I want to get something to eat. Well, it's about 9 o'clock at night, Christmas Eve. Anybody want to guess what's open at 9 o'clock at night on Christmas Eve? Waffle House. Well, we and about 1,000 other people decided to eat there at 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve. We waited about an hour to sit down. We waited about an hour to get our food. We finally got back to his house about 11 o'clock that night, and my dad said, I want to talk to the children. The grandchildren had to leave the room. There were 9 of them, and there were 4 of us children. And my dad said, I want you to take the bed out of the bedroom, take all of your mother's clothes out and all of her jewelry. I don't want anything that was hers in that bedroom tonight. I can't sleep in there again, in that bed. So at midnight, we're swapping a bedroom. My friend Brian reached out to me about 7 years after his mother had passed away, and he said, Jeff, I'm worried about my dad. We don't know what to do. My sisters and I want to have an intervention and try to talk to him, and I need some advice. What should I say? I said, what's going on, Brian? He said, the Christmas tree that was up on Christmas Eve when my mother passed away 7 years ago is still standing today. There's still gifts under that tree. The coffee cup that she used that morning before she passed away is sitting on the table. My dad hasn't touched it. He won't let us move anything. I want to ask you a question today. Which one of those 2 men handled their grief in the right way? And I hope you say that the answer is both of them did. Because no 2 people are going to grieve exactly the same way. And it's important that we know that, because when somebody tries to tell you how you ought to be grieving, how you ought to be doing, and how far along you ought to be, I've got some close friends of mine, and they say, Jeff, why aren't you dating yet? You should be getting married by now. Well, I want to slap them, first of all. That's not their business. Nobody can tell you how to handle grief, because no 2 people handle grief in the same way. The second part of this is that no 2 grief experiences are the same. It was different when I was a pallbearer at my friend's funeral in high school than it was when my mother passed away, and then when my father passed away, and then when we lost a baby, and then when my wife passed away. Every one of those experiences are different. Every experience. And you may have gone through numerous grief experiences in your life. I heard recently from a fellow who was telling me about the fact that he had lost his wife, and he had a son who committed suicide, and he lost a daughter in the same year. Every grief experience is different. No grief is the same. It's important that we understand that. And it's important that we know that just because I felt one way when my mother passed away doesn't mean I'm going to feel exactly the same way when my father passed away. So no grief is the same. Number three. Number one, grief is not sinful. Number two, no grief is the same. And number three, grief is not just about death. It's not just about death. Grief is really about loss, and it can be anything. A child will grieve if they lose their favorite pet. You may grieve because you have to move because of a job change. You may grieve because you've had to go through a divorce, or you've dealt with pain and heartache of divorce, or a broken relationship, or a close friend. Something happened that caused you to lose that friendship. One definition of grief is that it is the normal and natural emotional reaction to any change in your heart and familiar behavior patterns. It could be a change in ongoing relationship, a move, a change in employment, a change in health, a verbal or physical assault, or these are just a few of the things that can trigger a grief response. And your reaction to those other types of grief is sometimes, there's a scientific term, it's called disenfranchised grief. And what that means is that others may not recognize that these are grieving experiences, but it doesn't mean that they don't cause you emotional pain. Have you ever been around a group of people and they're talking maybe about some loss that they've had in their life, and then somebody comes up and they say, well, that's nothing, let me tell you what happened to me. You know, they want to kind of kidnap the conversation. And you hear about what they're dealing with, and you think, well, that really is nothing compared to what I've had to go through. And so sometimes we call that disenfranchised grief. But it is not just about death. Last January, I was doing a seminar over in South Carolina, and a man came up to me. We were sitting having lunch, and he came and walked up to the table where I was sitting. He said, "Can I sit down?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Can I tell you why I'm here today?" I said, "Sure." He said, "My wife passed away about 5 years ago," and he said, I'm doing better, and I've gotten over that. But he said, last year my two sons presented me with a gift of 2 parrots, 2 birds. And he said, those birds some days were the only creature that talked to me. He said, they were my constant companion. And he said, last month both of those birds died. And he said, I would never say that it was as difficult as it was when I lost my wife, but it was difficult as well. So he said, be careful and don't make fun of people, and don't talk down to people who grieve in a way that is not about physical death of a human being in their life. So grief is not just about death. Number 4, grief affects us in every dimension of our lives. It affects us in every dimension. It's not just intellectual, even though it includes that. Oftentimes, people will give you logical reasons why you shouldn't feel sad. Let me give you some reasons why you should feel better. The problem is, ladies and gentlemen, that grievers are not suffering from broken heads, they're suffering from broken hearts. And all of the logic in the world is not going to fix a broken heart. And so grief affects us in every single area of our life. Grief can be overwhelming. You know, we spend a lifetime learning how to acquire things, how to get things, how to build relationships, but nobody really ever teaches us what to do when it comes to losing them. And a lot of the information about how to deal with loss is really misinformation. There are people who feel like when they lose somebody, they're going crazy. We had a lady in the church who lost her husband, and she called the office one day and she said, she said, it's time for me to get the taxes done. And she said, my husband always did the taxes. And she said, I don't know what to do. He told me he had papers in a file, but I can't find the file. She said, could you send some people over and help me find that file? So some ladies from the ladies group went over to her house, and they were going to help her straighten her house up, and they found that file, and the lady who found it came to me later, and she said, Jeff, the file was sitting on the kitchen table on top of a stack of books right there in the open. What is wrong with her? I'll tell you what's wrong with her. She was grieving. And sometimes when you're grieving, it feels like you've lost your mind. One person said, I'd have all these different emotions flooding my mind. Some were good, about joy and peace, and at the same time I was angry and upset. You ever felt that before? There are some feelings that you have that are filled with joy and happiness, and they bring peace to your heart, but at the same time you're torn up. And this person said, am I normal? Am I going crazy? A lady told me that she had gone to a wedding, and all of a sudden she couldn't breathe. She said the pain and the grief was suffocating. And then she said she went home and cried one of those ugly cry type moments on the kitchen floor, and she said, it's been 9 months. Shouldn't I be doing better now? Heard about a fellow who was in the grocery store, and he couldn't find his glasses. And a clerk came over and said, can I help you, sir? And he said, I'm looking for my glasses. I can't find them. He said, sir, they're on your head. He thought, then I'm losing my mind. So grief can feel like you're going crazy. Let me mention some of the areas where grief affects us. First of all, it affects us emotionally. It affects us emotionally. That means there might be irritability, there might be fear, there might be volatility, there might be numbness, there might be despair. It affects us emotionally. Secondly, grief affects us behaviorally. That means there could be social withdrawal, disrupted sleep, restlessness, crying out of the clear blue at unexpected times. My wife was a big fan of the Eagles. I'm not talking about the Philadelphia Eagles, but the singing group, the Eagles. And I like the Eagles, but she was a huge fan of the Eagles. And so I took her to 8 Eagles concerts during the time we were married. And the last concert we went together was an Eagles concert in Dallas. And in her last months, she couldn't get out in crowds because her immune system was gone. And so on Saturday morning, she'd say, let's go for a drive. And we'd get in the car and we'd drive out in the country, and we'd turn the radio on that satellite channel 7, 70s on 7, and they'd play a lot of Eagles songs. And when an Eagles song would come on, she'd pull out her phone and she'd say, who was singing in the group when they wrote that song? And she'd figure out who was singing and when it was written and what the song was about. And that was one of her favorite things to do when we would take a ride together. Well, about 4 months after she passed away, I was going down to Dallas to visit the hospital, and I was on I-35 going south, and that should be sinful in and of itself, but I was on I-35 going south, and all of a sudden, an Eagles song came on the radio, and it hit me, and I started crying. And I couldn't quit crying, and I had to pull off the road because it triggered that memory of that time with her on Saturdays. Grief affects us behaviorally. Number 3, grief affects us cognitively. It affects us cognitively. We can be forgetful. We can lose track of time. There can be loss of concentration. There are feelings of, I don't know how I'm going to survive. Distorted thinking patterns. There's a real thing called the face in the crowd syndrome, in which it is believed that 80% of grievers think they hear or get a glimpse of their loved one after they have passed away. So it affects the way we think about life and about what's happening in the world. And I can tell you that I don't think the same way now that I did 5 years ago when my wife was alive. So it affects us cognitively. Number 4, it affects us physically. It affects us physically. Many people report more frequent illnesses, a loss of appetite, or even a loss of sense of taste, or eating more than they're used to eating, or sleeping too much, or sleeping too little. So it can affect us physically. And then number 5, it can affect people spiritually. And a lot of people are affected spiritually. Why did God let this happen? Why has God abandoned me? Why isn't my faith stronger? Shouldn't I have a faith that insulates me from this? And I can tell you that there were times that I wondered, why did God let this happen to my wife? When I know people who had the same kind of cancer, and they weren't near as good as my wife was, why did God let her pass away and not them? So it can affect us spiritually. So it's no wonder grieving people have this fear that they're losing their mind. And it affects, like I said, the way we act. And sometimes it causes us to do things and even say things that we would have never said or done before. It can strain relationships, and we'll say more about that in the second session. But I have 3 precious grandchildren, and they're kind of like my lifeline these days. And they used to live in Norman, Oklahoma. They worked in campus ministry for 13 years there. My children did. And now they've recently moved to Hot Springs, Arkansas. By the way, I've got about 9,000 pictures of my grandchildren here if you're interested. But I would go up to visit them in Oklahoma, and I would take the grandchildren to a hotel and spend the night. They didn't have room for me in their house. They had a small house, and it had 3 bedrooms, and they had lots of animals. And they know that I wasn't a big fan of lots of animals, and so I think every time I told them I was coming, they went out and bought another animal. They didn't want me to stay with them. So I'd take the grandchildren. My youngest grandson, his name is Forrest Austin Scott. Austin is my name. It was my dad's name and my granddad. And people say, how do you get his name? Well, that's a family name. And they named him Forrest because my children are tree huggers. But some of y'all will catch that later. Forrest was 3 years old, and he wouldn't leave the house. He had never spent the night away from home. And I said, Forrest, why don't you go with me? He said, Pops, I'm not old enough. I said, when will you be old enough? He said, Pops, when I'm 4, I'll be old enough. So we had his 4th birthday, and Forrest, after the party, he was left the room. I said, where are you going, Forrest? He said, Pops, I'm 4 years old. I'm going to get my stuff. I'm going to spend the night with you tonight. So he got his stuff, and we went to the hotel, and the other 2 kids were going to come later. And we stayed in the Embassy Suites there in Norman. I always requested a room on the 10th floor because the kids like the elevators and all. So we went up to the 10th floor, and our key didn't work on the door. And so we got the second key, and it didn't work. And so we had to go all the way back down and get 2 more keys. And we went all the way down and got our keys and went back up, and the first key didn't work, and the second key didn't work. And my grandson's getting frustrated. I'm getting frustrated. He said, Pops, do we have to go back down to the first floor again? I said, no, we're going to call the maintenance guy, the front desk, and they're going to send the maintenance guy up here, and he's going to open the door for us. So we called, and they said, he'll be there in 10 minutes. Well, you can guess how that went. About 30 minutes, he hadn't showed up. About 40 minutes. About 45 minutes, I see this guy get off the elevator, look like a maintenance guy. I said, Forrest, I think the guy's coming. What do you want to do when he gets here? He said, Pops, when that guy gets here, I'm going to punch him in the face. So I thought, okay, I understand that. I want to punch him in the face too, but I thought, okay, I'm the adult here. This is a teaching moment. I'm supposed to help my grandson. So I sat him down, and Brian, I gave him a 3-point sermon. I said, Forrest, I said, you can't punch people in the face every time something doesn't go your way. I said, secondly, I said, Jesus would not want you to punch that guy in the face. I said, the third thing is, Christians don't punch people in the face. And I promise you, my 4-year-old grandson looked at me and he said, Pops, I'm only 4 years old. I'm not a Christian. I'm going to punch him in the face. Well, sometimes when you've been through pain, and to him, that was painful. That was a grieving experience because he didn't want to sit there and wait on the door to be open. In his little 4-year-old mind, that's all he could think of. And we were out at Red River that same summer after that, and they had never been to Red River, and they came that year. And I was telling them about one time we saw a bear up on the side of that hill, that ski slope. Y'all know where that is. Bill Watkins and I were sitting out at the Capo Cafe, and we saw a bear up there. And I said, we've seen bears and seen elk and deers. And my youngest grandson said, Pops, if I see a deer, I'm going to punch him in the nose. And I'm thinking, what are my children teaching this boy? That's what I'm thinking. But my point is that sometimes that grief causes us to do things and say things that we would not ordinarily do. Grief affects us in every area of our life. Number five, grieving people will have numerous questions in their life. There are numerous questions. First of all, there's the big one, the why question. Why did this have to happen to my spouse? Why did this have to happen to my child? Why didn't God heal them? And we'll ask that why question more times than we thought possible. So there's the why. Secondly, there's the what question. What could we have done differently? I can't tell you how many people who have lost a spouse that I've talked to since losing Laura, who said to me, I feel guilty because I don't know if I did everything I could have done. What else could we have done? We had great doctors in Dallas, and we went to Mayo Clinic out in Arizona, and we went to MD Anderson in Houston. And I still said, was there anything else we could have done? What could we have done? And then there's the how question. How can I live more fully to honor my loved one? How can I love better? How can I embrace people that are close to me? How can I grow from this moment? How can I have stronger relationships with others? How do I carry on now that this has happened? I remember my children standing beside me at that grave, and one of them said, Dad, what do we do now? And then there's the when question. When will this get better? When will I feel better? When will I feel like living again? When will I feel like going out in public? When will I feel like talking to people? When can I carry on with my life? When does it get better? I have people ask me all the time, Jeff, when does it get better? And my real answer to that is, I don't know. It's only been 4.5 years. There are days it seems a little bit better, but there's still days I don't want to get out of bed. There are days I don't want to face the world. I certainly don't want to stand up and preach. So when does it get better? Grieving people will ask the why question, the what question, the when question, and the how question over and over and over again. So we say that to say don't be ashamed if you have these questions in your mind. It doesn't mean in any way that you have a lack of faith. That's not what that means. And when I read the passage that we read earlier from 1 Thessalonians 4, it is easily apparent that Paul is writing that in response to some questions they had about grieving. And maybe one of the questions was, is it wrong to grieve? And Paul said, it is not wrong to grieve. Just don't grieve like people who don't have any hope. And so there's nothing wrong with asking questions. And some of those questions may never be answered to our satisfaction. I still don't know why my wife passed away at the age of 59 years and didn't get to see her grandchildren grow up. I don't know the answer to that question, and I may never know the answer to that question. And so some of the questions we will never know the answer to. Well, number 6, well, you know what? We'll pick up number 6 after our break. We're going to take a break for about 15 minutes, and we'll come back in here, and then we'll cover the rest of the material. Again, if you have some questions about something that I've talked about today or something that I haven't talked about that you'd like for us to address, if you write them down and hand them to one of us, we would be glad to take them.